And I agree that time is short and there's a lot to get done as a music student. But I would actually argue that this kind of rounding out and diversity in your education would make you a better musician because you're a more well-rounded human being. And what we do is tell our human story. So if your human story is incredibly narrow and restricted, that's the human story you're telling through your instrument.
Hello and welcome to the 6th episode of Performing Labor. My name is Rob Simonds, and I am your host. This podcast features interviews with accomplished performing musicians who are doing interesting and creative work from within performing arts institutions and outside of them. We'll unpack their training, their practice, and their careers, how they got started, how they stay sharp, and their ambitions for the future. And it's my hope that these interviews will provide value no matter where you are on your musical journey. If you're thinking about a career in music, if you're in music school now, a working musician yourself, or if you're a music lover and just curious to learn more. For this episode, I talk with Donna Parkes, Principal Trombone of the Louisville Orchestra and the Colorado Music Festival. Donna has a jet-setting career, so while we're all grounded now because of the health crisis, I took this opportunity to catch up with her, to talk about her career, and to see where she is putting her energies now. And you'll hear in this interview that she's directing a lot of focus into committee work, into forward-looking and forward-thinking ideas, particularly around what will certainly be an unpredictable concert season. And for organizations like ours that are used to planning years in advance, this requires using some new muscles. But it's also an opportunity for reevaluation and reform. There's a book that I return to often by the George Mason University professor, Hugh Hecklow, called On Thinking Institutionally. And an especially useful distinction Hecklow makes is between thinking institutionally versus thinking about institutions. The latter of those is at least laced with some selfishness, and at worst is explicitly self-dealing, the literal opposite of institutional thinking. A couple of days ago, there was an article in the New York Times that quoted the Washington Post's executive director, Martin Barron, where he gave, perhaps unintentionally, a pretty succinct definition of institutional thinking. Quote, "The Post is more than a collection of individuals who wish to express themselves. The reputation of the Post must prevail over any one individual's desire for expression." Close quote. So look, I'm an institutionalist by nature, and I will go to my grave believing in mission-driven pursuits. However, I think legacy institutions, like orchestras, can lull themselves into an unearned sense of institutional thinking, confusing tradition with stagnation. But reciprocally, and equally hollow, I think, is the inverse reaction to confuse newness for reform. And what I think Donna really gets at in this interview is something different, not a middle ground, but a way of thinking about the industry's future that explicitly lifts up and sustains its stakeholders. In my opinion, at least, this is a hugely important topic, where the health of the institution is linked with the health of the profession. There is a distinction from substituting yet another artistic prescription, and to paraphrase Martin Barron's Washington Post quote from before, particularly if that agenda elevates an individual desire above the whole. In top-down organizations, the mechanism for artistic change, even radical change, is relatively straightforward. It might not be easy, and it might come with a high transaction cost, but it's absolutely possible right now. But it's marginal, relative to the rethinking of an orchestra in more public terms, something the Louisville Orchestra is doing now. This conversation really got me thinking, and where I land, at the moment at least, is making more of a distinction between the music and the institution itself. There's a concept called public value, coined in the 1990s by the Harvard Kennedy School professor, Mark Moore, that says that through a sloppy and deliberative process, a democratic people can define their own public value. Public managers are then in the business of creating that value, an analog to shareholder value in the private sector. Something like this is at play in orchestras, that to get better, healthier, and more effective, stakeholders must identify what they truly value, what the public would value from us, and how orchestras might function in the network of civil society institutions charged with public problem solving, and therefore creating public value. And I suspect programming and artistic decisions are a piece of that puzzle, but not the ends in itself, as is too often portrayed. Donna returns many times to the idea that the Louisville Orchestra's greatest asset is the sense of experimentation in its DNA, and how it was reignited by Teddy Abrams, but now has become something even more essential. In more normal times, and if not sensitively managed, a culture of experimentation is not always inclusive and risks breeding resentment. What's interesting here, in this situation though, Donna talks about how she's never seen this level of interest, engagement, and flexibility across the institution. It seems that there is an opportunity to seize on those energies and to build coalitions that might not otherwise be possible. Please enjoy this interview with Donna Parkes. Donna Parkes, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Rob.
Yeah, so we obviously worked together for many years in Louisville, and we worked together in the summertime or the winter in Arizona. But your career has taken you all around the globe to perform, but obviously now everything is shut down. No one's playing anywhere. Can you tell me a little bit about how the Louisville Orchestra first reacted to this health crisis?
Absolutely. I think like every other arts organization, it's been just a fundamental shock to the system. I think the orchestra here is in some ways really well prepared for this because we've been on a tangent of real creativity and doing very different and interesting things here as an organization. So I think in that regard, the orchestra has the capacity and ability to really embrace this situation / opportunity, depending how we can look at it, as a year of really different thinking and art producing. So with the music director we have, with Teddy Abrams being here, this is certainly exactly what he does best. So I think at this point, the orchestra is looking at what this year can look like. What are the options? What are the possibilities for this year? There's been new committees formed. There's been a lot of discussion around that. And certainly the musicians are very motivated here. Everybody obviously is really missing performing and being together. So everybody is just, I've never seen so much enthusiasm and motivation to create a way to succeed this year. And whatever that looks like or whatever format that takes, there's certainly an enormous amount of energy to make this year successful. It's going to look completely different, but I think it's true to say this organization, from board, musicians, management, everybody is really just trying to get us moving forward and finding ways to create solutions this year.
It's interesting that there has been such a huge cultural shift in the organization. And one of my previous guests talked about, as she's a songwriter, was talking about how those artists that had prepared a platform were much better positioned to take this on. So do you see the work going forward and building on what you guys have already done? Do you see that largely online, or do you see that as being some kind of in-person performances and interactive performances?
I think initially the planning needs to be for online. I think we need to take the safe and the healthy as paramount to everything else right now. And there's just not enough information about where we are. So I think initially, and I think this year is a great year to, not just at the outset of it, but throughout the whole season, potentially really establish some great online initiatives. There's certainly a huge need in healthcare facilities, in assisted living facilities, for music and art as therapy. So that's one direction I know that's being investigated here. Certainly that's something we can all do from the safety of our homes and really be effective in helping those people who are the most isolated and struggling the most at the moment. I think the other options are finding these safe ways to play live. We've started a Friday Front Porch series here where we're taking musicians who have either quarantined together, so married couples, or very small ensembles, so 2 musicians max, standing 6 to 8 feet apart on a front porch, and then just having neighbours come and sit socially distanced with masks, and just enjoying live music again, because there has to be a way for us to create live music. And I think there are ways to do it such that the musicians feel safe and the audience feels safe. It just is going to take a lot more planning and a lot more thinking about the ways to give those opportunities while everyone is able to feel really confident that they are safe.
Mm-hmm. Right before the shutdown, we were able to stream some of our kids' concerts out and reach a lot of kids that were supposed to come to the hall. I was really proud of the organization for pivoting that way. But since then, we've also done some of those live concerts from people's homes. We do it every week. Do you see those concerts as being kind of a scheduled affair that are free and open to everybody? Or is this kind of as the capacity speaks to when you can do it?
I believe it should be a mix of the two, Rob. I think we should have sort of pop-up front porch concerts so that we just get to get out and play, and neighbours get an opportunity who may never have been to the orchestra to just be walking down the street and hear classical music, sometimes for the first time. I think that's a wonderful opportunity. Then I would like to see the organisation have scheduled concerts like a living room series where perhaps Friday around the time we had a matinee, or Saturday evening when we would have our 8 p.m. concert, have a scheduled concert that our usual audience could buy online tickets to and participate in an online event. And I think the neat opportunity with that and all of these online ways of performing is we now have the possibility to have vastly greater audiences than we've ever had. Obviously, all of our orchestras have a certain capacity in their hall. There's no reason now that these concerts can't be going to other states, to other countries, anywhere in the world. So I actually think it's exciting in that way, because I think we can reach a completely different audience this year. And I like that you mentioned the education. In my opinion, that's the other avenue that we really have to look into this year. A lot of not just younger schooling, but also obviously universities are potentially looking at a fall online this year. So I would like to see orchestras really strategizing and coming up with programs that can be streamed, online lessons, online masterclasses, online just music education is such a wide array that we could do. I think that's an area with the necessity of online teaching now that really is a void that we can help fill.
So you used the word art producing a little bit ago. So do you guys see this as an opportunity to create new works, or maybe commission new works, or create special things for special audiences as an entry point?
Absolutely. I think this is I mentioned before, as an opportunity. I think this is a chance to reach new audiences, absolutely. And I think it's, especially with what's going on in our world right now and all of the issues we're facing, it is a time that we need to create new art and really focus on the issues that are at hand and finding ways to connect to the people dealing with those issues and ways to represent different parts of our community. I think that's always been a challenge for classical music. And I think this year is such a brilliant opportunity to do much more of that, to really take diversity seriously. And that can be through commissions. That can be where the focus is. That can be one of many things. But this is a real way to move forward in a healthier, more inviting, more diverse way this year, I think.
So you're talking about what's going on in the world, and obviously Louisville played an outsized role in the national protest because of the murder of Breonna Taylor and David McAtee. And the Louisville Orchestra and Teddy, you guys had kind of a bring your own instrument, play along community gathering at City Hall. Can you tell me a little bit about that and how that all came together?
Absolutely. Teddy really was the brainchild behind that. As anyone who doesn't know Teddy Abrams, he's incredibly motivated. He has more energy than any other human I've ever met, but he is absolutely become a very important part of the community here in Louisville. He's incredibly active. So for him, with what was happening in our city and the enormous amount of energy and focus that was on the race issues that we're dealing with here, Teddy really felt the need to do something. And having gone through the last few months as we have, I had a very, very strong sense that I wanted to do. It's very hard, I think, for those of us who are creative and musicians, artists, to just be sitting and not doing. So the idea was initially we were going to try and do an Louisville Orchestra event. That became a little challenging because we haven't really got the protocols for health and safety finalized yet, as we're all our organizations are struggling with that. So having done that completely and have it in place, it didn't seem like perhaps that was the right avenue for this event. So Teddy decided to make it a community event, which actually was a fabulous idea because we had a really great mix of musicians from right across the community. We had students, we had teachers, we had lots of different parts of our community represented. Essentially, we played 2 pieces. We met on the day, no rehearsal. We all printed out our music. We stood safely distanced. Those who could wear masks to play did. And it was a really, really important and moving community builder for me. And not only because I haven't performed in public for, 4 months. It felt so good just to share making music with people. And there was a good amount of fellow musicians who still participated. So seeing those people and playing with those people again really is impactful, but much more importantly is it was a show of solidarity and a show of support for the Black community here and for all of the things that we need to move forward and change. It was a really great way just to show up.
Yeah, so you used the word community builder. It's kind of a cliche almost when arts organizations talk about that. But in the case of Louisville, I think it's actually true. Teddy, at least when I was there, used to make the analogy to his role, and maybe the organization's role is almost like an unending political campaign. And on some level, it absolutely is just an analogy or a metaphor. But there's a book I read recently called Politics is for Power, I think is what it was called. And the point is that there's a lot of like performative gestures in online and on the streets. But if you can actually get people to move, to do things, that's actual power. And the LO currently seems to have that, right? There is the capacity to do these great collaborations and to send signals explicitly or implicitly about what we're trying to say. Do you think that can play more of a role industry-wide? So let's say Louisville's doing it. There's these wonderful collaborations with the Black community and the St. Stephen's Church. Teddy goes and plays for refugees. You guys are getting in there working with homeless folks, juvenile detention centers, Hearing Institute, dementia patients. So lots of great community work. How do you see that as being a part of the future of the industry?
I honestly think it needs to be the basis for it. I think this year and this whole pandemic is a great time to just reassess what we do and how we do it. And I think the organizations that survive and thrive through this are going to be the ones that truly serve their communities. It's no longer enough to just be an organization that serves a small portion of the community in a very specific way. I think this is a chance for all of our arts organizations to take stock and think about what other ways we can serve our community better. I think the LO is on a good track in that regard. I agree with you that we are doing more collaborations, that we are doing things that move us forward in that way. Because if we don't engage the diversity of the community, we can't really call ourselves the Louisville Orchestra. Mm-hmm. So I think the more we do of that this year and find the things are successful, and this is honestly a good year also just to test the water in some ways and see what things connect with people, what things are successful, so that we can build them into an ongoing structure for the organization. I think it's a real chance to represent a far greater number of the people we want to represent and serve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember when Teddy joined the orchestra, he said something to the effect of, he won't be satisfied until he reaches every single one of the 1.2 million people that call Louisville home. It reminded me of the Tiger Woods quote where he's like, won't be satisfied until he shoots an 18 on the golf course. I thought it kind of the like they're really, yes, it is an absurdly high bar, but why shouldn't a community organization, if it's going to call itself that, strive for it? And what I know about you, and I feel the same way in my own career, is that community work, engaging with people is definitely a two-way street, that the benefits flow both ways. And you're actually the second Ford Musician of Excellence winner that I've had on this show. And so you won it in 2019, I believe.
Yes.
So tell me about how that all came about and the partnership that the Louisville Orchestra has that sparked that.
So the award I was given last year was primarily based around the work we do with the Heiser Institute. And the Heiser Institute is essentially a school for children with hearing disabilities or challenges. Some also have verbal challenges, but it's really a hearing focused school. The goal of the school is to get the students in when they're extremely young, and then they want to transition them as much as they can into regular school and prepare them for life. We started that program, I believe it was started 10 or 11 years ago. I began the program 10 years ago, bringing individual or duet groups of musicians into the classrooms there. Very small classrooms, 5 to 8 children at a time maximum. Really, really fun, dynamic, exciting presentations of the individual instruments, really engaging, so that it's, for some of these children, it's not only the first time they're seeing or hearing an instrument, it might be their first year with cochlear implants and actually hearing sound. Mm-hmm. So for me, the first time I went there, I remember walking to my car afterwards and thinking, I've never felt this much excitement and just such enthusiasm for a project, and felt like it was really meaningful, like I'd really done something today. Mm-hmm. The impact you have on those kids when you see, and especially with a brass instrument, I play trombone, so it's especially fun because not only they can put their hands all over the instrument, they can feel the vibrations, and we take instruments in that we clean and sanitize so they can all have a go playing the instruments. So creating sound, and with the vibration of a brass instrument, it's so cool for those kids because they can feel it. They can, it's a really tactile experience for them. And it makes me so happy because they react and you see this response. And I've heard so many wonderful stories of parents who it really did ignite a love of music for some of the students, and that they wanted to go and hear live music. They wanted to sing, they wanted to dance, and it just opened up a whole world that they'd never, ever even been exposed to. So to me, that kind of work is just so important. It's so meaningful. Mm-hmm. And I love a good Mahler symphony. Absolutely. That's a really important, significant artistic event as well. But when you look at a 4-year-old who's making sound for the first time and they're just deliriously happy, for me, it really resonates with me. It really just makes me happy as a human being.
Mm-hmm. In that partnership, do you work closely with the staff too? Do they help guide you through that process?
The staff there is incredible. I just want to mention that all of the staff who work there with the students are phenomenal. And they have a music therapist. When this program started with the orchestra, the then education coordinator was Deborah Moore, who's an incredible human being and educator. But she set this program up so that the music therapist would work with the students every day at Heiser, or several days a week at least, and then she would really facilitate the sessions. So conversations with her around what are the things that will be the most effective for these students, what are the things we can do to make this the most enjoyable and educational for these specific students, because it's very different than going into a regular classroom, obviously. Mm-hmm. So Greta is the classroom teacher, the therapist who is there. She's been there since almost the start of the program. So there's a lot of institutional knowledge around the best way to work with the orchestra musicians. And I always encourage new musicians who come to the LO to really try doing Heiser. And it's not, I understand community engagements like that is not for every musician, and different community engagements are not right for everyone. But I always encourage the new musicians to go and experience it, especially with a more experienced LO member, because the staff and the music therapist in the room are so wonderful at what they do, and they really make it very easy for a musician to come in and just engage with those students in a really successful way.
So I often think the analogy is similar to when we go into the public schools or something, and if we can work in tandem with the teachers, the impact is so much more augmented. And I think that's the real test of whether or not these initiatives have staying power and impact. If you were thinking like kind of pie in the sky, how would an orchestra offset the lack of skills that a new hire comes in? So you said that you encourage folks that informal connection between player to player is unreproducible in any other way. However, how do you institutionalize that? Would it be a new staff member? Would it be a person whose expertise is community engagement? What do you think?
I think having a staff member who that's their expertise so that they can coach new musicians and kind of walk them through that and give them, little mock ways of trying out material that they want to present in the different educational settings. I would love to see that happen in orchestras because I think the impact we have can be incredible in those places. Likewise, they can be not successful if the musicians you send out the community either aren't engaged or motivated or inspired to do the work. So I think it's identifying the right musicians to do that kind of work. And then I would love to see someone on staff really being able to give them the tools and give them the information. I think there's a lot of assumption that people who play instruments can teach. That's not true. Because you play an instrument does not make you an educator. There's a whole nother skill set that's really important to doing any kind of education work. And I think that's something that we could have a lot more help and guidance with from our institutions. And I also would like to see when it's a specialist school like the Heiser or any of the other places we go to, that we bring that music therapist or that staff member or whoever it is, the point of connection, to the group of musicians who are going to be performing over the course of a season and just have a session with them to give them more information, to give them more detail about how the people or students we're playing for may react or interact with us and how to best handle those situations. I think a lot of musicians are very intuitive people and a lot of us figure it out essentially on the fly. But I would love to see more thought and more process go into what we present in those situations. I feel a lot of times like education is seen as the secondary sibling to performing. And I think that's a fallacy. In some ways, I think it's more important.
So how do we push that up as an industry? How do we push that up in our list of priorities? Does it start at the university level, or does it start as soon as someone gets the job in XYZ orchestra, the expectation is there?
I would like to see it in universities. When you're doing a degree in music, this is part of what you need to learn because you're going to serve, I would hope you're going to serve your community in some capacity as a musician in your lifetime. I would like to see it taught as a class at university. I also would like to see institutions prioritize it more so that kind of knowledge and information is available from your first day as an orchestral musician, if those are things you want to pursue. And I know here it's certainly optional. In a lot of places it's not mandatory to do these kind of events. And I think that's a good decision because there are certainly some musicians who it's just not, they're not comfortable doing it, and that's fine. But I would like to see there be more of a process so that institutions could really prepare musicians to do this the absolute best they can. And that takes specialty training. That takes people who really know and understand and are specialists in pedagogy and in specialists in communication. And it's different. You mentioned 5 or 6 different kinds of outreach that we probably all do in our orchestras or through our community efforts. And as you know, all of those situations are very different. But I would love to see it be more of a priority because I think moving forward, big picture, this is going to be a big part of the how do we serve our community better. This is a big part of that.
I'm starting to change my mind at like the last 24 to 36 hours about this because I had recently held the belief that the change was going to come almost exclusively from orchestras, that the professional groups would be the drivers of this kind of innovation and change. But I had a really wonderful talk yesterday with a young woman doing some research, some qualitative research about orchestra musicians and community engagement. She really pushed me on some of my beliefs on this. And I still believe that there is a misalignment between schools and orchestras. So the schools often have the desire and the want to engage with communities and do good work and do educational outreach work. I know outreach is kind of a loaded word, but we know what I'm talking about. The flip side is the orchestra doesn't often have the capacity or the desire to do it, but have the community ties, roughly 120 to 150 concerts a year. But we don't have the capacity to do that. So I think it's going to be a dialogue between the two groups, and perhaps a more institutionalized connection between the University of Louisville and the Louisville Orchestra, or Rochester Philharmonic and Eastman, or something like that. And we often, as you know, we have such a hard time bridging that institutional divide. This might be the connective tissue that we need for that.
I love that idea. I think the sooner we bring this into young musicians' lives and into their conversations and their mindset, the better they're going to be as they move forward in their career. And I think for it to be really successful, I agree that it has to be in both of those institutions. It's not going to work if it's in just one or the other. I would like to see it taken on as more of a mindset that it's just included in any sort of music degree, performance, teaching, whatever the degree you're doing, that this is one part of that, of being a successful musician.
It's just that the window in music school and conservatory is so short to prepare kids to even have a prayer at being competitive, that the pipeline pushes in a certain way. What I don't think, in my experience, that the academy has been receptive to is kind of what you were saying. I don't want to put words in your mouth, and I don't want to exaggerate what you're saying, but you're making the point that maybe you get more enrichment from community work than you do from a Mahler symphony, and that hasn't, I don't think, quite filtered down to the.
I think we deal with a really, really narrow focus with our industry, and having gone through music conservatory and having the path that we've all had, it is a very narrow focus. Now, I agree that is necessary in one regard to really get to the level we need to be at to get these orchestral jobs and succeed, because it's extraordinarily competitive. However, I don't know that narrow focus is always the healthiest for musicians, and I would question whether it's actually the most beneficial. I would question, and I would ask, as a young musician doing an undergraduate degree, are you going to have a healthier, a better, more well-rounded education if you have these elements in the mix? And I agree that time is short and there's a lot to get done as a music student. But I would actually argue that this kind of rounding out and diversity in your education would make you a better musician, because you're a more well-rounded human being. And what we do is tell our human story. So if your human story is incredibly narrow and restricted, that's the human story you're telling through your instrument. So I would argue that you would become a better musician having more enriching experiences as a human being.
Beautifully put, Donna. I was thinking the other day that a few years ago, President Obama talked about how he thought that too many young people were being siphoned off, too many talented young people were being siphoned off by Wall Street. So how many great computer scientists and engineers and surgeons are we losing to the siren call of Wall Street? And I wonder if there's some analogy there in music, where the lack of opportunity, the so narrow way we define success in our industry, if there were other opportunities on the table, that people that may not have the fire in the belly and the only thing they want to do is play a Mahler symphony would have some alternative. And I think that's something we need to develop.
I think that's so important, because you just look at the sheer numbers of our industry. Wonderful graduates are coming out every single year from every conservatory, and there's so few jobs. And after this pandemic, who knows what our industry is going to look like in terms of numbers. I think it would be a healthier option regardless of a pandemic, but more importantly because of the pandemic, for young musicians and young artists to be given more scope, that there are more ways you can create a career. And I think people are starting to do that and be open to that. But I would like to see that sense of the orchestra job is the only mark of success. That's just not true. I think we get told that. I think we buy into that. I think people who win orchestra jobs are phenomenal musicians and players, and you have to be a very dedicated person to get to that level. But I don't think it's the only mark of success. And I would love us to stop seeing it as the singular way you can be successful in this industry.
Yeah, I'm proud of my accomplishments, and I, like the rest of my cohort, we all worked really hard for this. But I reminded of an essay that Peter Thiel wrote, and I don't agree with him on anything, but I thought this was kind of an eye opener for me. Was he wrote a piece, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal a number of years ago, called "Competition is for Losers," and his point is actually about monopolies. But the point that he was making that resonated with me is, after, I think he went to Harvard or Stanford or something, as soon as he got out of school, he got into this elite New York law firm. And he only lasted 6 months, but he got there, and the realization was that everyone there was just like him. And everybody hated it. Everyone hated every second that they had to be in this office, which was probably 20 hours a day. And so you have all these people that do all the right things. They're the highest achievers. They're the top in their class, and they get to a place and they all hate it, but they can't leave because of the status and the money. And right. I think we're in kind of a similar situation where we can't leave because of the status.
I would agree, because of the status. And I think and I love playing in orchestra. I find it really rewarding, and I absolutely love it. But do I think that's the only way you can be a successful musician? 100% no. So I would just love it if we could start valuing the other things more and giving people the sense of freedom that there are legitimate ways other than just an orchestra. And even if you have an orchestra job, there are very few musicians that I know who have stayed in an orchestra job for year after year after year and haven't found other creative outlets. Mm-hmm. I don't know many who have just done their orchestra job and that is it. Most of them are doing chamber music or solo activities or finding other ways, even non-playing, different creative outlets. So I don't think we should treat the orchestra as the expectation of this will fulfill my entire artistic need, and it should. I think that's completely backwards in thinking. I feel like that's expecting one person in your life to give you absolutely everything you need as a human being. It's just not reasonable. I'd love us. I would love it if we could be open-minded enough and flexible enough and to feel supported as young musicians to look at the other avenues. And there's probably a million ways to create a satisfying musical life that I haven't even thought of, that young creative people are going to come up with through this pandemic or in the years to follow. But I would love us to be supportive of that and have the flexibility to believe that that's valid.
Well, let's pivot there, because I think it's a good place to turn. That you have had a really rich career outside of the LO and the Virginia Symphony before that, and that you played in orchestras all around the world. But you have a couple of regular gigs in the summertime, in the winter in Arizona, like we said, and in Alaska. Can you tell me a little bit about those and what they mean to you?
Sure. I feel so lucky. I'm incredibly grateful, because I feel like I've had opportunities that have become regular engagements outside of the LO that really give me different kinds of satisfaction and artistic fulfillment. So the one in the summer is Colorado Music Festival. I play in that festival every summer in Boulder, Colorado, which is just one of the prettiest places I've ever seen and really suits me as a person with lots of outdoor hiking and all kinds of good mountain time. It's also a phenomenal orchestra. And I also really enjoy coming together with a different group of musicians. I think that's really healthy for us. And I enjoy that part immensely. And of course, these are people you see every summer. So you have like a whole second family of friends that you get to see and enjoy every summer. I also do go to Alaska twice a year, usually. Once in the summer, I teach at a fine arts camp called the Sitka Fine Arts Camp, which is an incredible arts camp that brings children from all over Alaska, also different parts of, the country, but really focuses on giving students there a chance to dive into the arts and try all kinds of fun things, and they somehow managed to, it's run by a gentleman called Roger Smith, who is an incredible person, but really finds faculty that's phenomenal. So for me, I usually just do 2 weeks there. The camp runs for different ages right through the summer. I usually do 2 weeks. Phenomenal. And then in the winter, I go to Alaska and play a brass ensemble concert for a holiday brass show. So I get to enjoy Sitka twice a year now, which is amazing. And then in winter, we get to go to Arizona, and that's another place where I've done that for a long time. So it's, again, groups of people that I get to see again and interact with, and that festival orchestra is always amazing. And so I think having that diversity of experience is really, for me, is essential, to be honest. I really thrive on that, having these different places to go. And I also love the relationship building that you get over many, many years. In Arizona, I started that festival about 10 years ago, and we have hosts there, as you know, and I got hosted with a beautiful woman who I have become very dear friends with over the years. She came to my wedding. And it's just those kind of relationships that you form and build over a number of years that I just adore. I love that music gives me access to different people and being able to build those relationships in different places. I really love it. And for me too, I'm a traveler, so I have a hard time sitting still. Quarantine might be the death of me, but sitting still is really hard for me. So I always just enjoy the traveling aspect of it as well. So I just feel very grateful that I have all those opportunities, and I'm very aware that it's taken a long time to build a career that gives me those opportunities, but I try very hard to never take any of them for granted.
Yeah, I find that the festival atmosphere, sometimes I feel like I tire of it, but once I get there, I'm really super fired up about it. And not the least of which is that you have a separate second community or a third community of audiences and donors and volunteers that you get to know over a number of years, and it's always a nice reunion. But these are also like mini ICSOM conferences where you can kind of trade stories and get some perspective from other players.
Absolutely.
You can talk shop and get some career advice. So you're talking about the outdoors, and that's important to you, and fitness is important to you. And how does that all play into your just keeping your general equilibrium?
For me, I discovered a long time ago that if I'm not outside and I'm not healthy and moving, I'm a far less happy person. So I started, I've always been very outdoorsy. I grew up in Australia, so a lot of beach time, swimming, very active, very outdoorsy culture because of the weather growing up in Australia. But when I got to the States and I got my first orchestra job, I started long distance running, and that became a real staple for me. And I realized it does make me play better. Because if I'm in better running shape, I have better air control and air capacity. Yep, 100%. It makes me a better trombone player. But the reason I do it is, I like being healthy and staying in shape, but it just puts me in a better mood. And I want to say, caveat, I was never a runner growing up, and I don't always enjoy it when I'm doing it. And I don't always want to get out the door, but I have learnt that it makes me, for the rest of the week, a much just fundamentally more positive person. So it really became something that I have made part of my life, and I stick to. For me, and I would assume a lot of musicians can relate to this, but I'm very goal oriented. So I discovered that signing up for races, half marathons, was a great way to get me out the door most days of the week and give me something to really work hard towards. And the thing I love about running is the results are very tangible, because you can train and get faster within a week or two. With what we do on our instruments, a year could go by and you feel like you're maybe 1% better than you were last year because of the degree of improvement. Whereas for me, running, I was kind of a newbie when I started. So the improvement was really quick, and that was really fun just to have something that I was like, wow, this is big improvement really quickly. And it is also about community. I started running in Virginia Symphony with a group of musicians, mostly women. It really was social to begin with. We would run and chat and just enjoy the time. And I remember we did our first 10K and thought that was insanely long. And then as time went by, we did our first half marathon, and we would run the entire race together. So it was a really bonding It's a very, very important part of my friendships with the women there. And then we ended up doing a full marathon together. And then as we won other positions in other orchestras, we would then fly to a marathon somewhere in the country and still run together as a team. So it really became something that was tied into very strongly into my friendships and into the people who still are the most important people in my life.
As you're talking, two things popped into my head. That one of, I think, the universal lessons of being a musician, of being a serious instrumentalist, that is applicable to many things, is just getting started. I find that the most intimidating thing is the closed violin case in my practice room every morning. But it's not so bad after I get to the first 10 minutes. And I feel the same way about exercise. But I think it applies to almost everything in life. The other thing I kind of want to circle back to some education stuff is what you said about the slow pace of improvement. And I've got a colleague and friend in the Phoenix Symphony, Alex Lang, who runs an education program. His outside the orchestra project is called The Leading Tone is the name of it. And one of the things that he was trying to overcome with the education there was that thing you're saying, is that it's like you put a trombone or a violin in a kid's hand and say, in 10 years, you're going to be able to do something. But how do we devise education programs that people can feel the impact right away or very soon? And I'm not really asking you to answer it, but or if you do have an answer, I'd love to hear it.
I think it's really challenging. And I think it's more challenging with the current climate. I think people now are so used to immediacy in everything. We've got the 3-second attention span. So learning an instrument is actually even more challenging, I think, than it used to be, because the way we perceive things and the patience and the tolerance we have is different now. So I think the challenge is making it engaging, but also making it about the community. Because I know for myself as a young musician, I started in the 4th grade. A huge part of why I wanted to keep playing an instrument was because I just loved the band I played in and the people who were in it. And I realized when I was about 12, when I got to do we did a trip to Japan with the band that I played in. And I realized all of a sudden that this community, we traveled and we did things as a group and those friendships, and that was all tied into music making from the beginning for me. So I think once you get those two building blocks, the initial engagement and the music, building a skill set, but also that it's just a really great way to feel to be a part of something. And that making music with other people is why we do this. And I think that grabs young musicians from the beginning. And I think that's one of the things we need to emphasize and utilize to really get kids engaged and wanting to stay in music education.
Yeah, it's a really wonderful and astute point. And I think we sometimes lose sight of that yes, we do play these instruments so that we can be with other people, and we perform on them so that we can be with other people.
And I think too that it's fun. I feel like we forget that it's fun. And that's something I actively remind myself of. I think when you're a professional for such a long time and there's a lot of stresses and demands, and I think it's very easy to get caught up in it and in the ego of it. And it's really healthy to remind ourselves and young students that it is just meant to be fun. We do this because it's literally a way to play. To have fun, to just have a good time. That's what it's meant to be about. So I think the more we can keep that as the center of the concept, it's just meant to be a good time.
Yeah.
That's why we're doing it.
What is kind of going back to the beginning of our conversation, one of the hurdles that I think we have to get over, and I don't think it's impossible by any means, because we have people in our orchestras that know how to do some of this stuff to a certain degree, is just the quality of the recordings that we do. So we play on these essentially 19th century instruments. And then when you pair them with a beautiful concert hall and your 75 other colleagues, we can make a big and glorious, robust sound. But the sounds we make in our practice rooms with our cell phone cameras leaves a little bit to be desired. And one thing that I've, in terms of being ambassadors for this instrument, these instruments in this music. And so if you compare and contrast it to the thousands of guitar videos that are made. So there are guys on Instagram that have launched careers because they can reproduce a sound that sounds the way you imagine the best guitar sound is,
Right.
which the violinist has yet to achieve that I've seen on Instagram, to put it mildly. I did see an ad on social media the day for James Ennis, who is doing some recitals from his home that look and sound amazing. I mean,
Oh,
obviously
I saw that. It sounded phenomenal. And I was so interested. How are they doing that?
That is the model, right? That is the thing that we have to aspire to as performing
Yes.
artists, because we can't flush all our standards down the toilet just because we don't know how to do it.
I feel like, and this is such, again, it's an opportunity for all of us, a challenge for all of us, because I agree. I think it's very disheartening when you first hear, the cell phone version of how people sound. I mean, it's really upsetting. Mm-hmm. So I think this is the time that we need to educate ourselves. We need to come up, and people, obviously there is a way to do it. So it's a chance for us all to become better at it, because I feel like, of course, we sound so much better in any hall, even out playing outside to a live audience, but especially in a concert hall. But I think right now the challenge is, how do we get closer to simulating mm-hmm. that? Because I agree that I don't want this to become the bad cell phone sound to become the accepted norm. Mm-hmm. I think we can do better than that.
Agreed.
I hope we can.
So I want to take a big jump here and talk about how you got started. So obviously you grew up in Australia, and you grew up in the capital of Australia. Tell me about that city and its cultural life.
Sure. First of all, it's not Sydney. The capital of Canberra is Canberra. Australia is Canberra. A lot of people try and tell me that it's Sydney. It's a really interesting conversation for me when they try and convince me that it's Sydney. I'm like, I'm pretty sure I've got this. So I grew up in Canberra. I was born in Shepparton, which is a little town in Victoria, but pretty much grew up since I was 2 in Canberra, and just lucked out that Canberra at the time had a phenomenal conservatory, a school of music that was not yet affiliated with the university. It was a separate conservatory type school of music, had an incredible band program in my elementary school with very, very good music educators. I look back now and think, how did they do that? Mm-hmm. They were so good, and we learnt so much, and yet I just adored it, and I adored them. And I've got my parents have a few old recordings on cassette tapes of those bands, and it sounds amazing. Mm-hmm. So I lucked out, I think, is a big part of it. I found an instrument that came easily to me in the 4th grade. I started on trombone. I didn't have any other musical experience. My parents were not musical. My older sister chose trumpet. She was 2 years ahead of me. So I found an instrument that just worked for me, and I had wonderful teachers, and then managed to, because I was in a smaller city, I managed to start taking private lessons on scholarship when I was, I believe, 11 or 12. So started having really phenomenal teachers. Because the School of Music was so small, there was one trombone teacher. So I was learning from the same teacher as the undergraduate and graduate students at 12, which now in the context of America seems insane, mm-hmm. but really lucky. So had a series of phenomenal teachers. The teacher I had in high school now plays in the Chicago Symphony, Michael Mulcahy, and just had an environment that was very pro-music. Our family, my parents were very supportive. They didn't really know music or understand it, but were very supportive, came to everything, all the concerts. I joined all the bands, all the ensembles, just loved it. And I mentioned earlier, for me too, it was a social activity. I just loved the people and the sense of community. And then I started traveling and getting these amazing opportunities really quite young. So it was very lucky to be in a small pond, I think. And it just was something for me that I just loved it from the beginning. I just really loved playing. I never really, with the trombone, I was never thinking, oh, I'm going to become a professional musician. That was never really my train of thought. It was just that I absolutely loved it. It was so fun.
So was this city, was it like a lot of government towns? Was that the dominant industry, or was there a bit of a robust culture?
It is essentially a government city. And if you ask any Australian, they will mock Canberra and make fun of us because it's given that same sort of, it's very stale and very governmental. And that's why we moved there, because my dad had a government job. But it did have a really rich art scene, and still does, has phenomenal arts. And the part of it that I think was really lucky, in that conservatory, there happened to be some of the most world-class, honestly, brass teachers. So the brass studios were at such a high level, phenomenal level. So for me, my concept of sound and what I thought was good brass playing was unbelievably high from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And I remember moving to America and thinking, gosh, everyone in America is going to be so much better, and the level is going to be twice as good. No, the level's the same. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that blew me away. Far more musicians here. The numbers are different. But I look back now and I think how fortunate that the level I was exposed to was very, very high from the beginning, because as a brass player, your whole concept of sound, that's where it comes from. How you build that concept, and the sound you make comes from the sound you, like all of us, the sound you hear in your head. And mm-hmm. those were the building blocks for me. And so, then
So you were saying that you had these amazing teachers, and that is irreplaceable. But were there concerts that you can think back that you saw as a kid that really stuck in your memory?
I think it was playing with the musicians who were all older than me and much better than me. Mm-hmm. And I really believe in that theory of, if you are surrounded by people far better than you, you catch up quicker. Mm-hmm. And I think I was in that scenario, being one of the few high school students in the conservatory. Often we would play trombone quartets or brass ensemble, and I would get to play with the undergraduates and graduates. And the level was such that I think that really excelled my progress and really helped me get to a place of much higher level quicker than I would have. And being in those groups and ensembles of different ages, and I was usually on the younger side, I would audition for everything. So I got into a couple of groups when I was really, really young, but I think that served me well, because I really loved the challenge. I loved just trying to catch up with the other players.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned coming to the States. You came here for grad school, is that correct?
Yes. Okay. So finished my undergraduate in Canberra, and then did about a year of freelancing in Sydney, and was playing with, the phenomenal orchestras, the Australian Chamber Orchestra, the Sydney Symphony, the Australian Ballet, and Opera and Ballet Orchestra, and sort of looked at my situation and thought, really in Sydney there's two orchestras, and there's only sort of 7 major cities in Australia. So do the math. Most cities have one orchestra. Mm-hmm. Sydney and Melbourne are the only ones who have 2. So you do the math, and that's less than 20 jobs in the country, and they were all filled. And I just sort of looked at the situation and thought, I'm either going to go to the States or to Europe. And for me, the logical transition was to come to the States, because of the way I had been taught and the pedagogy I'd been exposed to. The American School of Brass Playing made more sense for me to gravitate towards. So basically just packed up my life into literally a backpack and got my trombone and got on a plane with not nearly enough money in retrospect. Mm-hmm. And moved to Chicago and went to grad school at DePaul. Mm-hmm. And I nearly died of cold because I moved in January, mm-hmm. which is the middle of summer in Australia and the middle of winter in Chicago. But yeah, best move I could have made. Total leap of faith. Knew one person, and that was the teacher I was going to study with.
And so you were probably at a lot of CSO concerts.
A lot of CSO concerts. And at that point, I couldn't afford to buy tickets. So I'm not ashamed to say I was of the wait till the intermission and asked the people who left after the concerto for their ticket. Mm-hmm. I heard a lot of great concerts. I went to every masterclass, everything I could absorb. For me, coming from a smaller city, this was just brass wonderland. Mm-hmm. So many concerts, people, musicians to hear. And I played in the Civic Orchestra when I was there, which absolutely blew my mind, that I was sitting on orchestra hall stage, and we got some of the conductors that CSO got during the season. So it was Rostropovich and Boulez, and this was mind-boggling to me, mm-hmm. Coming from where I came from. So absolutely just a complete game changer having those experiences, and then gave me sort of the platform to see all these opportunities. And that's the difference with a country with this kind of population, is just the amount of opportunity is vastly different. Mm-hmm. So started taking auditions for some academies. Summer festivals don't exist in Australia. There is really no equivalent. So started auditioning for those, and then auditioned for New World Symphony, and then that was sort of the first step in the beginning of the career.
Tell me about your experience in New World. How long were you there? What did you learn?
What did I learn? I learned a lot. I was there for 2 seasons, and to me, and I say this to this day, that New World was probably the one orchestra where I looked around and every single musician on that stage was 120% in. Mm-hmm. Everybody was really focused and sounded amazing, but it was more about the motivation and the mentality. And as wonderful as our professional organizations are, that's a really hard thing to come by again in the professional world. So just being around that and being around people who were just so fired up and excited and motivated. And for me also, MTT was a huge mentor and had a huge impact from me, and really showed me how much of a difference it can make when you have someone who just believes in you and takes faith in your musicianship and your dedication and really wants to see.
I was thinking about, as you were saying that, about the level of buy-in at a place like New World. Obviously, it's a very self-selecting group, right? Like, obviously, people that are really focused on doing this for a living audition for it. They're only the best get in. But I was thinking about the equivalence of like college sports, and how sometimes college coaches, like college basketball coaches, have a really hard time making the adjustment to the pros, because the pros have a different view of their job, right? It is a job. It's a high paying job. It's a high profile job. But there is a enthusiasm that the college kids have. That's why the tournaments are so exciting. We know this in Louisville very much. And I was thinking, one of the things that I learned when I first left college and got a job also in Virginia in the Richmond Symphony, was that one of the things that wasn't taught to me, or taught, I think, in school, is navigating the intergenerational part of the job, and that people are just at different points in their life. It says nothing of their playing necessarily. It has more to do with just, their demeanor, their whether or not they come to meetings, how they present in rehearsals, but it's all a part of the gig. What are some of the things
I'm glad to hear you say that, because that was actually the one thing that I found very difficult when I had my first professional job, was that the intergenerational thing. Also, just that people, it means different things to different people and at different stages of their life. And I, having been around the musicians in New World and the Civic and very focused conservatory, I couldn't wrap my head around people who just didn't really care. Mm-hmm. I found that very, very difficult. And I really had to come to terms with how to process that in a way that was healthy for me and still be able to be really positive towards those people and engaging with those people. That was a tough transition. And I agree that we are not prepared for that in any form in music school. And as you know, when I was in Virginia Symphony, I played second trombone, but as a principal, which is my position here in Louisville and in Colorado, it really is your job to make it work with the musicians you have and to bring out the very best in them. And there's been a lot of learning for me. I hope I've learned a lot about that, but really how to take different musicians where they are and simply bring out the best in them, and not having the expectations that you have of yourself of anyone else.
I don't say this is universal, but I've been in 4 orchestras now. And as I look around, there are different people, and there are different players and at different stages of life. And each has strengths and each has weaknesses. Nobody is perfect by any measure. But I think one of the things that our industry doesn't succeed at, especially the orchestras, the full-time orchestras that have some deficits, let's say mostly physical deficits, like don't play in a great hall, or the salary is not necessarily commensurate with the workload. There's a term in housing policy called the missing middle, right? So like in this country, actually in the English speaking world especially, it's a problem where you don't have enough housing in the middle. And that's the real difficult spot to fill. And I think there's something similar in orchestras, which we have, that it's often mid-career players, and I say this as a mid-career player myself,
Me
where
too.
you often see the people giving the least, right? Or the people that are, maybe said a different way, are giving the least of their potential. So sometimes the newest players, their level of playing is super high, but they're distracted by the learning curve, they're distracted by other auditions. You've got older folks that don't have given up their hang-ups and are playing their hearts out. But how do we sustain people across a career is a piece of the puzzle I don't think anybody has solved.
I think that's a really good point. I feel like you're spot on. I don't think we have solved that. And I think that's something, if we could have more dialogue about that or have more conversation about how to deal with that, it really would make a huge difference in orchestras. Because I see that everywhere. And it was interesting. I was just talking to some musicians yesterday from different orchestras about what this next year is going to look like. And I said, look, my concern is that it's going to be the same 8 musicians from every orchestra that put their hands up first that are going to do the lion's share this year, because I feel like people get into roles and they just stick to them. I wish there was a way to have better dialogue about that and to find a way to bring people, across those lines, because I think the institution would be way more successful if we could. And I think that's a challenge. I mean, I'd be curious to hear your take on this, but as a mid-career musician, it's challenging to find, when you're young and you're hungry for the job, there's just endless drive and motivation, and things shift and you have to find a way to find the same level of dedication and drive and focus, because there's a certain ease that comes with having a position for longer or being very familiar. And I think we have to challenge ourselves far more at this stage to really stay driven and focused and contributing all we can. But I wish there was more dialogue about that. I think it would be helpful.
I don't think this is a solution for everybody, but it's something I've been wrestling with for a long time. And this kind of dovetails a little bit with our talk about the Mahler symphonies and community work. Some famous people in our industry, maybe not performers, but writers, there's a line that they like to go back to, that classical music is fine. It's the institutions that are in trouble. And I get what they're saying, and I get what they're trying to mean by that. And the way they're presenting it, I think it's probably correct, but I don't agree. And I think it puts the equation backwards. And so I believe that the institution is important. Classical music it's a thing. It's one of many things that we do. But my orchestra is about to celebrate its centennial. It's been around for 100 years. The LO has been around since the late 30s and seen a lot of ups and downs, a lot of changes in Louisville. And the activities that the orchestra does, in my mind, are incredibly important as any piece of abstract music. So the place that these institutions hold in their cities is where the value is captured. And I'm not saying we can play anything, but we overweight what we play. And certainly to some degree, we overweight how we play it. And what I'd like to see is organizations prioritize connecting the stakeholders to the group, because the group is connected to the community, not the ghosts of composers past.
I think that's exactly the focus that I have. And I have said this in so many meetings and in so many different contexts, that I do believe in the inherent value of classical music. I think it's a stunning art form. I think the art form in of itself is immensely valuable. But what we do is about people. It's about one person connecting to one person and then expanding from there. And I think we can do a far better job of creating those connections, encouraging those connections, and those connections being the basis for then what we're doing from there. Because people respond to that. That's what people respond to. It's that kind of connection. And I know, Fran, I'm sure you've had these experiences that you'll have a conversation with a neighbor, and because they know Rob, who plays in the violin section, they will come and experience Mahler for the first time because they can sit in the seat and point to their spouse and be like, hey, there's Rob. So I wish we could focus more on those parts of what we do as institutions and build those bridges and make it really focus on accessibility and changing. There's so much we could do, I think, to change the format and the way we reach people and how we bring them into what we do. And I think, like you said, I really believe in the art form. I believe there's just inherent beauty and value in what we do, but I also believe we can do a much better job of connecting to our communities and the many, many ways we could be doing that.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great place to leave this conversation, Donna. Do you have any recommendations on things that people might want to listen to or read or anything?
I have one recommendation that's a little left field, but I'm going to put it out there for you. And some people have now seen this film, and there's also a book, but there's a documentary called Free Solo, which is about a climber. I don't know much about climbing. I have a husband who is an avid climber. I know nothing about climbing, but we watched this documentary, and it is so inspiring just as a human feat what this gentleman does. Alex Honnold.
Yeah.
Yes. So have you seen the documentary?
I have. He's amazing.
I mean, it's insane. As a physical act, as an act of strength, just as a human being doing something, it's incredibly inspiring. But the part I liked about it, and the reason I would recommend it for anyone who's an artist or a creative type of person, is because for me, what was really fascinating was the psychology behind him and how he talks through, and you see his process to overcome the most insane level of fear. What I enjoyed was his process and how he prepared, how he psychologically got himself into a place, and here's the important part, to be totally free and just play. That's what he's doing. When you see him do what he does, to any other human it looks ridiculous, but you see his expression and he is just having the time of his life. Because he's done all of that preparation. It's so analogous to what we do, right? Mm-hmm. He's done this enormous amount of physical, mental, all the preparation. But when it's game time, when he goes to do what he does, it's just fun because he's done all the work and now he's just being incredibly present and having the best time. And I just think there's such a big takeaway for all of us in that. I learned so much watching that film. In all the ways. So that would be my takeaway. Free Solo. Well,
thank you. Thank you again for making time. And it was great to see you.
My pleasure. Always good to see you, Rob.
Thank you for listening. The music on the show, as always, is by Louisville, Kentucky-based guitar virtuoso Craig Wagner. There's more about Craig in the show notes. We'll be back soon with more interviews. The next one features violinist Matt Albert, principal second violin at the Cabrillo Festival of Contemporary Music, and professor at the University of Michigan. So please go ahead and hit subscribe.